A marriage built on passion ended in blood. The church bells were supposed to signal joy. White roses lined the pews, a photographer adjusted his lens, and dozens of guests waited in hushed anticipation. But when the bride never stepped through those chapel doors, the celebration curdled into confusion, and then horror. This wasn't just a wedding gone wrong. It was a love story laced with obsession, betrayal, and a darkness no one saw coming. Hours after being left at the altar, the groom snapped, unleashing a storm of rage that would forever scar two families, a community, and the very idea of happily ever after. What drives a man to turn a moment of heartbreak into an act of irreversible violence? Was it rejection? Humiliation? Or a passion so consuming it could only end in tragedy? This is the story of Daniel Whitmore and Claire Reynolds, a couple whose romance began like a fairy tale, but ended in blood on the very day they were meant to vow, "Till death do us part." But before we reveal what happened on that fateful wedding day, let's go back to where their love began. Because the red flags were there all along, but no one recognized them until it was too late. On June 14, 2019, in the quiet town of Maplewood, Ohio, the community was buzzing with anticipation. The Reynolds family, well-respected, middle-class, and deeply rooted in local church life, was preparing for the wedding of their daughter, Claire Reynolds, 27 years old. She was known as kind-hearted, ambitious, and devoted to her family. Her fiancé, Daniel Whitmore, 29, was a rising sales executive at a regional tech firm. To outsiders, Daniel was charming, confident, and devoted to Claire. Friends described them as the picture-perfect couple. They had met 5 years earlier at a 4th of July barbecue. From the very first moment, Daniel seemed smitten. He looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, recalled one bridesmaid. The wedding was to be a grand celebration. 150 guests, a lavish reception at the Maplewood Country Club, and a honeymoon planned in Santorini. It should have been the happiest day of their lives. But that morning, whispers began to circulate. Claire was late. Not fashionably late, hours late. Her phone was off. Her maid of honor was panicked. Her parents were pacing the floor of the church vestibule, making frantic calls. Daniel stood at the altar, shifting his weight nervously as guests began to murmur. At first, people assumed Claire had cold feet, that perhaps she needed a moment to compose herself. But as the minutes stretched into hours, it became clear, the bride wasn't coming. According to investigators later, Claire had spent the night before confiding in her closest friend. She confessed that she wasn't sure she could go through with it. That Daniel, despite his outward charm, had a side that terrified her, controlling, jealous, quick to anger. Her friend urged her to reconsider, but Claire brushed it off, saying, "I'll deal with it after the wedding." That morning, however, something shifted. Claire never showed up at the hair salon. She never answered texts from her bridesmaids. By noon, she was gone. For Daniel, the humiliation was unbearable. A packed church had witnessed his rejection. His family, his co-workers, his childhood friends, all present for what had turned into a public spectacle. The whispers turned into rumors. She left him. She ran away. She must have found out something about him. Daniel left the church that afternoon, pale and stone-faced. Within hours, Claire's life would end in violence. But the question remained, where did Claire go after she fled the wedding, and why did she end up alone with the very man she was running from? Every love story has a beginning, and Daniel and Claire's began on a warm July afternoon in 2014. Claire Reynolds was at a neighborhood barbecue hosted by mutual friends. She had just finished graduate school in education and was preparing to start her career as a middle school English teacher. Her friends described her as the kind of woman who lit up a room without trying. Independent, thoughtful, a touch reserved, but with a laugh that carried across the lawn. Daniel Whitmore, on the other hand, was impossible to miss. At 24, he was already climbing the corporate ladder at a regional tech company. He wore his ambition like a badge of honor, sharp suit, confident posture, and a voice that could dominate any conversation. When he saw Claire, he zeroed in immediately. He didn't just flirt, one friend recalled later. He pursued her like she was the only thing that mattered. At first it was flattering. Daniel brought her flowers, left notes on her car, and texted her goodnight without fail. He seemed attentive, thoughtful, maybe even a little too eager, but Claire convinced herself that was just passion. After years of dating men who treated her casually, Daniel's intensity felt like devotion. Within 6 months, they were inseparable. Within a year, they were living together in a 2-bedroom apartment near downtown Maplewood. But behind the picture-perfect romance, cracks were already forming. Friends noticed subtle changes in Claire. She stopped meeting them for weekly dinners. She hesitated before answering questions about her relationship. One bridesmaid later admitted, if you asked her if she was happy she'd smile, but her eyes told a different story. Daniel's charm came with a shadow. He wanted to know where Claire was at all times. If she stayed late at work, he accused her of lying. If she spent time with friends, he sulked or picked fights. His jealousy was disguised as protection. I just worry about you, he would say. I love you too much to lose you. When Daniel proposed after 3 years together, Claire said yes, but with hesitation. She confided in her sister that she wasn't sure she was ready. Sometimes he scares me, she whispered. But he says he can't live without me. Maybe marriage will settle him. Planning the wedding only magnified the cracks. Daniel insisted on controlling details. The guest list, the seating chart, even what songs could play at the reception. Claire wanted a simple ceremony, but Daniel pushed for extravagance, saying it would reflect his success. By the spring of 2019, Claire was showing signs of doubt. She visited her parents more often, sometimes staying overnight after arguments with Daniel. Her mother noticed she seemed quieter, more fragile. She used to be so full of life, her mother later told investigators. But the closer the wedding got, the more she seemed to shrink. The night before the wedding, Claire's doubts boiled over. At her bachelorette gathering, she confided in her maid of honor, Emily. Tears welled up as she admitted, I don't know if I can marry him. Something feels wrong. Emily urged her to listen to her instincts, but Claire shook her head. Everyone's here. Everything's paid for. I'll get through tomorrow and then I'll figure it out. But tomorrow never came. Claire never walked down the aisle. And what no one knew was that Daniel had already sensed her hesitation, and rejection was the one thing he could never forgive. The church clock struck 1 in the afternoon. By then, the whispers had become a chorus. Claire Reynolds wasn't coming. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bridesmaids whispered into phones, ushers checked the parking lot, and Claire's father stood near the vestibule door, his face pale, his hands trembling. At the altar, Daniel Whitmore stood frozen. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden edge of the pulpit. For 2 hours he had smiled politely, insisting to everyone that Claire was just running late. But inside, humiliation boiled like acid. When the officiant finally announced the ceremony would be postponed until further notice, Daniel walked down the aisle without a word. Guests parted like water around him. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't stay for the reception. He simply got into his black BMW, slammed the door and drove off. Witnesses recalled that his face was stone cold, but his hands shook violently on the steering wheel. For hours no one knew where he went. But later, investigators pieced together his movements. Instead of going home, Daniel drove aimlessly across town. Surveillance footage showed him pulling into a liquor store at 2:15 p.m., buying a small bottle of whiskey. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, drinking alone, staring at his phone. Then at 3:05 p.m. he made a call. Not to a friend, not to his parents, but to Claire. It went to voicemail. He left a single message, "You can't do this to me. You can't humiliate me like this. Answer the phone." She didn't. At 4:12 p.m. another call. This time his voice was darker, trembling with rage. "You think you can walk away? I'll make sure no one ever forgets what you did." By evening, Daniel's desperation turned to obsession. He began driving toward Claire's parents' house, the one place he knew she might be hiding. Around 6:30 p.m., Claire's parents' neighbors reported hearing raised voices outside. Daniel's BMW was parked crookedly at the curb, its door left ajar. Claire had come home quietly an hour earlier. She had slipped inside, avoiding calls and texts, hoping to hide from the storm she knew was coming. But Daniel found her. Witnesses saw him pounding on the front door, shouting her name. "Claire, open this door. You owe me an explanation." Her father tried to intervene, stepping outside to calm him down. But Daniel pushed past, forcing his way inside the house. What followed was a blur of shouting, sobbing, and the kind of raw, uncontrolled fury that marks crimes of passion. Daniel cornered Claire in the living room. She was crying, pleading with him to understand. "I can't marry you, Daniel. I'm sorry. I just can't." For Daniel, those words weren't rejection. They were annihilation. In his mind, Claire wasn't just leaving him, she was destroying him, stripping him of dignity, of pride, of the life he thought he was owed. Neighbors later reported hearing a scream that chilled them to the bone. Moments later, a loud crash, the sound of a glass lamp shattering against the floor. By the time Claire's mother dialed 911, it was too late. Police would later testify that the living room looked like a war zone. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, blood spattered on the cream-colored carpet. Claire Reynolds lay lifeless by the fireplace, her white silk rehearsal dress stained red. Daniel stood over her, his face streaked with sweat and tears, his hands trembling. In that instant he seemed less like a groom and more like a man who had lost everything, because in his twisted perception he had. When police arrived minutes later, Daniel didn't flee. He didn't resist. He simply sank to his knees and whispered, "She was supposed to be mine forever." The officers handcuffed him, leading him out of the Reynolds' front door as neighbors stared in shock. Some described him as eerily calm. Others said he looked like a man possessed. But one detail would soon haunt the investigation: a single chilling note left on the passenger seat of Daniel's BMW. It read, "If she won't be my bride in life, she'll be my bride in death." And with that discovery, investigators knew this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a love story that had spiraled into something far darker. When Maplewood police officers first arrived at the Reynolds home on June 14, 2019, the crime scene seemed almost surreal. Hours earlier, that same house had been buzzing with wedding day excitement. Now, the white roses meant for the ceremony were discarded on the kitchen counter, their petals wilted. Claire Reynolds' body lay covered with a white sheet, while stunned relatives huddled in the dining room, whispering prayers through tears. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly in the back of a squad car, his tuxedo shirt rumpled and stained. To the first responders, it looked straightforward: a fiancé left at the altar who lashed out in uncontrollable rage. But as investigators soon discovered, the truth was more layered and more chilling than anyone imagined. Detective Laura McKinney, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the Maplewood force, led the case. She immediately ordered the home sealed off. Every overturned chair, every shard of glass, every drop of blood was photographed and catalogued. What stood out wasn't just the violence, it was the evidence of obsession. On the living room coffee table, detectives found a leather-bound notebook filled with Daniel's handwriting. Inside, page after page detailed his anxieties about the wedding. One chilling entry read, "If she embarrasses me in front of everyone, I'll never forgive her. Better dead than to make me a fool." Nearby, they found Claire's cell phone tucked under a sofa cushion. The call log told its own story: 17 missed calls from Daniel in the hours leading up to the confrontation, each more desperate, more threatening than the last. Investigators then turned to witnesses. Claire's parents were heartbroken but cooperative. Her father described how Daniel had stormed into the house. "I tried to stop him," he told police, his voice breaking. "But he pushed past me like I wasn't even there. I've never seen eyes like that. They weren't Daniel's eyes. They were something else." Neighbors also confirmed hearing the escalation. One woman recalled the terrifying scream, followed by what sounded like glass breaking. Another swore she heard Daniel shouting, "If I can't have you, no one will." But perhaps the most telling testimony came from Claire's maid of honor, Emily. She revealed what Claire had confessed the night before: her growing doubts, her fear of Daniel's temper, her hesitation about the wedding. She wanted to back out, Emily told detectives. She said she didn't feel safe, but she didn't want to let anyone down. She thought she could deal with him after the ceremony. To investigators, that detail was crucial. It showed pre-existing fear, painting Daniel not as a man blindsided by heartbreak, but as someone with a pattern of control and intimidation. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from Daniel's car. On the passenger seat of his black BMW sat a folded piece of paper, a note written in bold, shaky handwriting. "If she won't be my bride in life, she'll be my bride in death." Forensic analysts quickly confirmed it was Daniel's handwriting. The discovery transformed the case. This wasn't just a spontaneous outburst of rage. Prosecutors now had evidence that Daniel had planned to act if Claire rejected him. Still, questions remained. Had he written the note before the wedding, anticipating rejection? Or had he scrawled it in those lost hours between leaving the church and arriving at her home? Either way, it suggested forethought, a detail that could mean the difference between a charge of manslaughter and first-degree murder. That night, Daniel was questioned at the Maplewood Police Department. Detectives described him as oddly calm, almost detached. When asked why he killed Claire, his response was chilling in its simplicity. "She humiliated me. She made me a joke. I couldn't let her do that." When pressed about the note in his car, Daniel smirked. "You ever been left at the altar? You ever had 200 people laugh at you in your face? She pushed me. I had no choice." To detectives, this statement sealed the narrative. Daniel wasn't remorseful. He was still clinging to his pride, still viewing himself as the victim. By the end of the week, the pieces of the puzzle were clear. Physical evidence, the overturned furniture, shattered glass, and blood patterns all supported the violent confrontation. Forensic evidence, the notebook and the BMW note established premeditation. Digital evidence, dozens of missed calls and threatening voicemails painted a timeline of escalating obsession. Witnesses, family, neighbors, and friends confirmed Claire's fear and Daniel's volatility. Detective McKinney summarized it bluntly: this wasn't love. This was possession. And when possession slipped away, he killed her for it. Within 10 days, Daniel Whitmore was formally charged with first-degree murder. But while investigators were convinced they had their man, the courtroom would soon become a battlefield, and Daniel's defense team had one final, desperate card to play. The trial of Daniel Whitmore versus the state of Ohio began in February 2020, 8 months after the murder of Claire Reynolds. By then, Maplewood had already transformed the case into a local legend, whispered in grocery store aisles, dissected in church pews, and splashed across front pages. The courthouse was packed on the first day of proceedings. Rows of spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, some clutching newspapers, others holding tissues. Claire's parents sat in the front row, their faces pale and drawn. Daniel, dressed in a navy suit, walked in flanked by his attorneys, his posture stiff, his gaze cold. Prosecutor Angela Soto wasted no time setting the tone. In her opening statement, she described Daniel as a man consumed by pride and obsession, who chose violence when he could not accept rejection. She presented the evidence methodically. The frantic voicemails left on Claire's phone. The chilling entries in Daniel's notebook. The handwritten note in his BMW: if she won't be my bride in life, she'll be my bride in death. Witnesses painted a vivid picture. Neighbors recalled the terrifying screams. Claire's maid of honor recounted her fears the night before the wedding. Claire's father described the moment Daniel stormed into their home. Every piece built toward a single conclusion. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of rage. It was a calculated crime. Daniel's defense team, however, leaned hard on the crime of passion argument. They painted him as a man humiliated in front of 200 people, abandoned on what was supposed to be the most important day of his life. This was not premeditated murder, defense attorney Mark Lowell argued. This was an explosion of heartbreak, of raw human emotion. A crime committed in the heat of the moment, not the cold calculus of planning. They tried to cast doubt on the infamous BMW note, suggesting it may have been written after the killing in a haze of shock. They emphasized Daniel's clean criminal record, his steady employment, his reputation in the community. Lowell ended his closing argument with a plea: do not mistake tragedy for premeditation. This was a man broken, not a monster plotting murder. The jury deliberated for 22 hours. Inside the courthouse, tension simmered. Outside, news vans circled like vultures, reporters ready to broadcast the outcome. Finally, the foreman stood. The words echoed through the courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Whitmore, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Claire's mother wept openly, her shoulders shaking. Daniel's parents sat stone-faced, stunned by the weight of the sentence their son now faced. The judge, unmoved, delivered the punishment: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Daniel showed no visible reaction. He simply lowered his head, his jaw tightening as deputies placed him in handcuffs and let him out. For Claire's family, justice felt hollow. Nothing brings her back, her father told reporters outside the courthouse. We just hope no other woman has to suffer the way she did. But in Maplewood, the verdict carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't just a conviction, it was a reminder that beneath the veneer of picture-perfect relationships, darkness can simmer. That love, when twisted by pride and obsession, can become lethal. Yet even after the verdict was read, one question lingered: what truly drove Daniel Whitmore from groom to killer? To answer that, we have to look inside his mind. What transforms love into obsession? What drives a man from the altar to the crime scene in the span of a single day? To understand the tragedy of Claire Reynolds, we have to step inside the fractured mind of Daniel Whitmore. At its core, Daniel's unraveling was about more than heartbreak. Psychologists call it a narcissistic injury, a deep, almost unbearable wound to the ego when someone's pride or self-image is shattered. Daniel wasn't just left by Claire. He was left publicly, in front of family, friends, colleagues, and 200 witnesses. To a man who lived for appearances, the rejection wasn't just personal, it was catastrophic humiliation. Instead of seeing Claire's absence as her choice, he saw it as an attack on his identity. In his distorted logic, Claire had ruined him. And if she destroyed him, he would destroy her. Friends once thought Daniel's intensity was romantic. The late-night texts, the constant check-ins, the way he wanted to be part of every detail of Claire's life. But in hindsight, those behaviors weren't love. They were control. Criminal psychologists often describe crimes of passion as driven by possessive jealousy. The victim is no longer seen as a partner but as an object, something to own, to control, to keep. When Claire tried to reclaim her freedom by walking away, Daniel's control slipped through his fingers. And in his mind, if he couldn't own her in life, he would own her in death. That chilling line in his BMW note, "She'll be my bride in death," wasn't poetry. It was pathology. Rejection is one of the most powerful triggers of violence in unstable personalities. Studies show that individuals with fragile egos or obsessive tendencies often interpret rejection not as a loss, but as annihilation. For Daniel, Claire wasn't just leaving. She was threatening his very existence, the image he had so carefully constructed. Every missed call, every unanswered text in those hours after the wedding fueled his spiral deeper into rage. What began as humiliation morphed into desperation. Desperation hardened into obsession. And obsession ignited into violence. The defense argued Daniel's act was heat of the moment, an explosion of raw grief. But the psychology tells a darker story. His notebook entries revealed anticipation of rejection. The note in his BMW showed intention. This wasn't a sudden slip. It was the climax of years of control, jealousy, and fragile pride. Daniel's passion didn't turn deadly in an instant. It had been curdling in silence all along. The wedding day was merely the spark that lit the powder keg. And yet, in a haunting way, Daniel's actions proved the very fear Claire confided in her maid of honor. "Sometimes he scares me. But he says he can't live without me." That fear was justified. For Daniel, life without Claire wasn't life at all. His love was never love. It was need. It was control. It was obsession wearing a romantic mask. Psychologists would later say Daniel's crime wasn't about losing Claire. It was about losing himself. And in trying to reclaim his pride, he ensured he lost everything. And as the gavel fell, as Daniel was led away in chains, one haunting truth remained: love had not saved him. Love had destroyed them both. A wedding day is supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, a promise of love, of partnership, of forever. But for Claire Reynolds, the day meant to bind her future became the day that ended it. The tragedy of Claire and Daniel is not just about one act of violence. It's about how love, when poisoned by control and pride, ceases to be love at all. It becomes something darker: obsession, possession, a hunger that devours rather than nurtures. Daniel Whitmore didn't just lose his bride. He lost his freedom, his future, and his humanity. And in the process, he stole Claire's chance to live the life she dreamed of. Crimes of passion remind us of a haunting truth. The most dangerous place for some isn't a dark alley or a shadowed street. It's standing beside the person who claims to love them most. So the next time someone says, "I can't live without you," remember Claire's story. Because sometimes those words aren't romantic. They're a warning. In the end, love became obsession, and obsession turned deadly. If this case left you chilled, subscribe to Dark Passion for more true stories where devotion meets destruction, and where love can turn lethal. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale of love gone tragically wrong.